Good morning. We are in Mark chapter 9. We're looking at a study of questions Jesus asked, various questions that he asked different people. And just by way of reminder, some of these we covered in the book of Matthew, and so we'll run across a couple of those in this section of Mark. But we left off last week. I told you I wanted to circle back and mention it again because of the overall context here in Mark chapter 9. This is coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus has been transfigured. We dealt with that question, which, as I pointed out last week, it is a statement in the King James. Some versions have it as a statement, some have it as a question. That's verse 12. But when he comes down to his disciples, there's this multitude that is, they're questioning with Jesus' disciples. And it's an argumentative type thing because they had tried to heal a boy who was possessed with a demon. They were not able to do so. So when they see Jesus, they're greatly amazed. They run to him, they salute him. Verse 15 tells us, and he asked the scribes, "What question ye with them?" And so we covered that question, but in that same context, one of the multitude answers and says, verse 17, so here comes the father of this young man who has been possessed by a demon. And he says, I brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit, is the way the King James puts it, mute spirit, we would say. Other versions have it that way. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. So he brought his boy to Jesus' disciples. They attempted to cast out the demon, but they couldn't. So Jesus answers and says, and this is a question we covered in Matthew 17, but he asks a question here, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. So they bring him unto him. And when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming. So this poor boy is having, he's got a difficult time. This demon will tear him, makes him foam, we might say foaming at the mouth, gnashing with his teeth, pineth away. It's a bad state that the young man's in. And even when he sees Jesus, when you see, a lot of times you'll see a very visceral reaction from these demonic spirits when they encounter Jesus. They know who he is. And of course, as we often point out from James 2, I think it's about verse 19, even the demons believe and tremble. But they don't have the kind of faith that the Bible talks about, saving faith, faith that does what God says to do. But Jesus asks a question here of the Father, and this is where we left off last week. He asked his Father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. He's been this way since childhood, in other words. And oft times it had cast him into the fire. So we learn a little bit more about how bad this poor young man's state is. And into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So Jesus' question is, how long has this been happening? Of course, he asked that to the father of the son with the mute spirit. And, again, Jesus knows. He knows the answer to this question. But that brings us to a question ourselves. Well, why ask that if he knows? We often say deity never asks a question for information. But as we pointed out with others, I think there's a reason here. Well, we know there's a reason, but it would seem that he's doing this to point out to the crowd just how bad this young man's state is. Of course, Jesus knows he's going to heal him. He's going to cast out this demon. But that highlights what a bad way he was in. And so he asked this question, well, how long has he been this way? It's going to really accentuate what Jesus is going to do for the young man, and of course also for his father. And so the appeal of verse 22 is, have compassion on us, help us. Well, he came to the right source for that, of course. this is the only time we read of the apostles failing in an attempt to do a miracle. But you know what? We never read of an occasion where Jesus attempted to do a miracle and failed. I think there's also something significant in that. Jesus is going to talk. In fact, they're going to come to Jesus and say, well, why could we not cast him out? He's going to say, well, this kind go without not, but, or the way it's worded here, verse 29, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. And he'll tell them, I believe it's in Matthew's account, that it was a lack of faith on their part. And so they needed more faith sometimes in casting out demons and performing the miracles that Jesus had empowered them to do. Even though they were given these great privileges, being with Jesus so frequently, sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning so much, and even the ability to do miracles, they're still humans. And sometimes their faith was not always what it should be. That seems to be the indication here. But Jesus, of course, never failed in attempting to do a miracle. If he sets out to do a miracle, it's going to happen, because he of course, was God in the flesh. But the other question I wanted to mention, I said we were going to come back to it, especially for verse 23, because it's rendered differently in different versions, but I think there's something significant here. Jesus said unto him, he's speaking to the father of this young man, I'm reading from the King James, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. The New King James has it as, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. And I've got a footnote there. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The footnote has it a possible variation, as it is in a different New Testament manuscript. And this is the way the ESV, English Standard Version. This is the way they render it. Jesus is making an exclamatory statement. If you can. But I've told you before, especially when you're dealing with unsealed manuscripts, where they would write what we would call all caps, there was little or no punctuation. So sometimes it's difficult to know exactly how to punctuate a sentence. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, sometimes very difficult. This is one where it's a little bit difficult, but I don't think it's that difficult, just from the context of the rest of Scripture. Jesus saying, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. That doesn't make as much sense, just because, well, could he believe? Sure. Jesus is not saying, well, if you have more capacity to believe, the capacity is there. It's tapping into it. And sometimes, then and now, we need to do a better job of developing faith, growing faith, but the capacity is there. So it doesn't really make as much sense to have him say, well, if you can believe. But it does make sense to have this either as an exclamatory statement, or ASV has it as an exclamation as well, but I think it was a New American Standard. It's not matching up here. Usually I've got like 4 different versions open, but they don't always match up. There we go. The New American Standard, which has been updated in the last, 10 years or so, but this is the NASB 95. But it has it as, if you can, ? So it's got Jesus asking a question there. And then he says, all things are possible to him who believes. In other words, the man says to Jesus, hey, if you can do anything, please help us. It's almost like he's not expecting a full healing, perhaps because of the failed attempts of the apostles. Maybe this demon is just so strong. But Jesus, if you can do anything, we'd appreciate whatever you could do. And so in one sense, the guy has a very humble, faith-filled attitude. But there's something missing there, and, maybe a lack of understanding, maybe a lack of knowledge at this point. And so he says to Jesus, well, if you can. And Jesus is sort of like, if you can, you just believe. All things are possible to him who believes. And, we've probably had similar situations in our lives where maybe you ask somebody where it ought to be obvious that they could help. That maybe they've got the authority to grant permission. Maybe they have the power to move something that I'm just not strong enough to move or whatever. And I say, well, if you can help, sometimes I was trying to think, it was years ago, there was something, I think it was with me, I may have been just with somebody, but anyway, there was something that was heavy to some people, but there's this big burly man there, and somebody says, I can't move this. And they look over to him and they say, do you think you can move this? And he was almost like offended, right? He says, can I move it? Get out of my way. And that was kind of how he approached it. And sure enough, I mean, he just, with what seemed to be very little effort, moved the thing. But that's kind of the idea here with Jesus. He's sort of like, if I can. This is not even a question of ability. You just believe. And in that context, verse 24, I think this is also why it makes more sense that this is a question or exclamatory statement. Straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. What a great thought. And this is one of the reasons I want to come back to this, because I don't know, there are some times, and I know sometimes it's an individual thing, maybe a passage resonates more with somebody, one particular passage resonates more with a person than maybe a different passage for somebody else. I know that's the case. Sometimes it's where we are in life and situations, but who among us has not been there, where we realize it's not speaking directly to Jesus today, but maybe through a study of the Word, I realize I'm not where I need to be in my faith. My faith is not as strong as it should be, or maybe not even strong as I thought it was. And we're like that father, and we just cry out, Lord, help thou my unbelief. Maybe it's something we iterate in prayer. Maybe it's something we just sort of in our soul cry out and say, you know what, I want to try to do better. But boy, that is, to me, that's such a relatable statement, because here's a man who he's at the end of his rope. And, if you have children, you understand a little bit about that. You see a child going through that. You see your child suffer. That's nobody enjoys that. He wants to see his boy made whole. And, whether it's a child or somebody else, anybody that we care about, you see them suffering. It might be an emotional suffering. It might be a physical suffering. That's difficult. And here's this guy, and he's kind of at the end of his rope, and he says, if you can do anything, have compassion and help us. And Jesus says, it's not a matter of can. You just believe. And of course, he's going to go on and cast out that demon. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit. This is verse 25. Saying unto him, thou dumb and deaf spirit, mute and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him. And furthermore, I would add, enter no more into him. Not just go out. You're not coming back. The spirit cried and rent him sore, came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he was come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could not we cast him out? And he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. So interestingly enough here, you have one individual and a group of individuals who are lacking in some measure in faith. The disciples, in that they were lacking the required faith that would have taken for them to be able to cast out this demon. But the Father, who recognizing he says, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. But again, I wanted to come back to that because I think that's so relatable to us, how that father felt, that desperation. It could be someone we see suffering. It may be our own suffering. It may be just a difficult season we're in our lives, and like that fellow, we cry out, as it were, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. He believes, but he understands my faith needs to grow, and I want it to grow. Teach me, Lord. And it reminds me again of a recent sermon that we studied from Psalm 139, David's prayer. Search me, O God, know me, try me, see if there's in me any evil way, and lead me in the way everlasting. And that's kind of this father. He sort of says, hey, I want to be an open book. You search me, you know me. Help me to grow in my faith and to follow you and do what you would have me to do. So a great question there Jesus asked, whether it's a question or an exclamation. But I think that's worth noting. If maybe make a note in your Bible there or something. Seems more like a better division of that to have Jesus saying, if you can, ? Or if you can, as an exclamation. You just believe. All things are possible to him that believeth. All right, so anything else on that? Yes, sir.
The disciples failed and the apostles failed in performing this miracle. Sometimes we find ourselves in the same place. We're not able to do the miraculous, but still God's blessings are still funneled through us as his children. Sometimes our lack of faith prevents people like this young man from receiving the blessing that was possible if we'd had the right faith to be encouragement or teacher, whatever God had given us the power to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Jimmy was saying that, with the disciples, there's, that also is relatable because they weren't able to cast out this demon. And we understand we're not casting out demons miraculously today, but, as he put it, God's blessings funneling through us. Maybe it's somebody I'm trying to reach out to with the gospel or help to be restored, or maybe it's my children I'm trying to bring up in the Lord, whatever. But sometimes we find ourselves unable to do that which we had set out to do. And so maybe you just sort of feel, and again, I think that's very relatable. And I think it's also interesting here to see in that context how differently Jesus deals with somebody like that and this father versus how he deals with the scribes, the Pharisees. Why is there such a marked difference? What'd you say? They were leaders. And like James says, my brethren, be not many masters, knowing we shall receive the greater condemnation. There, James 3:1. They should have known better. They were supposed to be the experts. They were leading people. And, of course, you also have the aspect of Jesus knowing their hearts. He knew they were hypocrites. And so when Jesus deals with somebody who knows the truth, they know what the Scriptures say. They know what they're supposed to be doing, and they just don't do it. He deals with them very differently than somebody who is coming along and they're just not quite where they need to be yet. Or maybe not even where they should be. None of us is going to be where we need to be as far as perfection, but maybe not where they should be in their growth. And so he doesn't say to this father, if I can, get out of here. You don't even have faith. He doesn't say that. You're not getting a miracle. You don't even have enough faith. No, that's not what he said. And with his apostles, he doesn't say, you people, I mean, how long have I been with you and you're just, this is ridiculous. No, he just makes a very plain, pointed statement. Of course, again, I think it's Matthew's account where he says, a lack of faith. And he says, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. And so it's a reproof in a sense of letting them know where they've come short and how they can improve and do better. But it's not this scathing rebuke as he would give and does give many times to some of those religious leaders. There's a big difference in the attitudes there. And I think, as Jimmy pointed out, both of these, the Father and the apostles, those are very relatable situations. Maybe we've failed at something we've set out to do, and you sort of feel like, man, I'm a failure. Sometimes turn that over to the Lord and and let him. And we sometimes put unrealistic expectations upon ourselves, and so sometimes we just need to turn that over to the Lord, especially when it comes to evangelism and maybe restoring somebody, because we can plant, we can water, but who's going to give the increase? 1 Corinthians 3:6. God does, right? So, but yeah, very, very relatable passage here, and I just, every time I read it, I find myself there from time to time, and that, when we find ourselves there, that's the Father's response is the way to respond. Cry out with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Yes, sir. Yeah, it may be that's their failure to cast out the demon created that little shadow of doubt in his mind, and so he's like, well, if you can, maybe you can do something. They couldn't, but hopefully you can do something. I mean, you are their leader. Yeah, that may be so. And Jesus is sort of exasperated and disappointed. Yeah, and it's not anywhere near the kind of scathing rebuke that the Pharisees get, but yeah, I mean, like, hey, you've cast a little bit of a shadow on what we're doing here because of not being where you need to be in your faith development at this point.
Which is what we also do in our day-to-day lives. If we're not careful, we can also cast doubt through our actions and our speech.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because that still happens today, where people are kind of like, well, if God can. And sometimes that's because, we have not represented him to the world as we should. Never thought about that. That's a really powerful point as well. As I said, it's a very relatable context, and we definitely can find ourselves there. Anything else on that? Good thoughts. All right, let's go on into. No. Sorry, I was about to say going into chapter 10. I'm about to miss another question. So when they depart from there, verse 30 tells us, they passed through Galilee. He, Jesus, would not that any man should know it. For he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. But they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. So, maybe, if to your point, Adam, that if he's kind of expressing some disappointment and again, I think at the very least he's reproved them here a little bit. Your lack of faith, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. And now he makes this statement about his death and his resurrection, and they're kind of, talking among each other perhaps and going, well, what is he talking about? I don't know. Ask him. I'm not going to ask him. You ask him. I'm not asking. Maybe they're a little bit bashful at this point about asking a question. But for whatever reason, they don't ask him here. Then you come to verse 33, and he came to Capernaum. Being in the house, he asked them, what was it that you disputed among yourselves by the way? Now, once again, here's a passage where I don't know about you, but I find myself here. It's relatable. Have you ever had somebody ask a question and they already knew the answer? Maybe they ask, hey, what were y'all talking about over there when I walked up? And maybe you kind of put your head down, nothing. Why? Because you were talking about them. Or maybe something that you didn't want them to hear for whatever reason. And so this is, maybe you're talking about something that you knew you shouldn't have been talking about, It could have been, maybe it's a situation of gossip, maybe it's whatever. But you knew what you were talking about was not really the best thing. And now they know, because they walked right up on it. Well, Jesus, he didn't just walk right up on it necessarily, but of course, being Jesus, he knows exactly what they were talking about, which again is one of those questions that is not asked for information. It's asked to make a point to them. Because what were they talking about? Who's going to be the greatest? And that's verse 34. They held their peace, for by the way, they had not just talked about it, they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. And so, you can almost picture this. They're walking along and some of them are talking, and maybe Jesus is a little ways ahead, and they figure, well, he can't hear us, and they're talking in hushed tones, and who's going to be the greatest? And you can almost hear maybe Peter or Andrew. Well, we were basically the earliest disciples. So it kind of makes sense we would be considered at least two of the greatest. And maybe other ones are going, maybe James and John chime in. Well, he didn't call you and Andrew sons of thunder. He's nicknamed us sons of thunder, power. That would seem to indicate to us that we're going to be the greatest. And maybe somebody else is saying, I don't think so. And maybe somebody says, pipe down, James. There's a reason we call you James the Less. You're not going to be the greatest. I don't know. They could have said who knows what. But you could just picture this conversation going on, and they're debating their reasons why I should be the greatest or we should be the greatest. And then Jesus just turns around and says, hey, once they get inside the house, he says, hey, what were you guys talking about? Y'all seem to be having a spirited discussion. What was that about? And you can just picture the heads going down, shoulders sort of slumped. Nothing. And a lot of us as parents have been there. You walk up, maybe you've been standing outside the room and you've heard the kids talking, and then you come up and say, well, what are y'all talking about? Well, nothing. You were talking about something. That was pretty adamant about that. No, nothing. So Jesus asked them, and they don't want to speak. But of course, Jesus knows exactly. But a lot of us have experienced that. Somebody just kind of saying, oh, by the way, and something that you thought was a very secret discussion turns out was not so much so. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And then Jesus essentially, to paraphrase here, says, okay, so you want to talk about who's the greatest? All right, let's talk about it. And he sat down, verse 35 tells us, and he called the 12, and saith unto them, if any man desire to be great, or first rather, if any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all, and servant of all. Not only that, he took a child, verse 36 says, and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said unto them, whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me, and whosoever shall receive me receiveth not me, but him that sent me. So Jesus, it's interesting to me that Jesus, when he wanted to teach a lesson about humility and service and who is the greatest, for at least part of that lesson, he took a child and he set him in the midst, and he took that child up in his arms, and he said, you become like a little child. And there are, I can't remember if I've ever, I think I've preached it here at Bremen, but I have a sermon idea. I know I've preached it somewhere. It may be here, it may be somewhere else, that I developed years ago. I'd written down the starter and finally fleshed it out, but I called it childlike, but not childish. Because there are traits of children that are very admirable, commendable. Children tend to be very quick to forgive. They're trusting. They're often very humble. They understand there are things that they just can't do, and they of course, the flip side of that is children can be prideful sometimes, right? My toy, that's my stuff. and even have that selfish mentality. And so there's a balance there, and you see this. Paul talks about it sometimes, where he'll say, in understanding, be men, but in your attitudes, be like children. In other words, be trusting in God, getting along, quick to forgive when there is something that comes between you and a brother, and that kind of thing. And so Jesus uses a child here to teach this lesson, and he says essentially, you want to be first in the kingdom, you put yourself last. Make yourself servant to all, because those are the ones who are greatest in the kingdom of God, in the Lord's church. And that's still just as true today. Jesus, he wants humble servants. He's not looking for bosses. He's not looking for folks that compete for top spot, top rank. He's looking for humble servants. I've seen situations in churches where maybe a church says, well, we need to add elders. So we're looking, see if I worked with a congregation one time where there wasn't a desperate situation or whatever, but they said, hey, we haven't visited this in several years, so we're going to, as Acts 6 says, we're going to look out from among us and see, is anybody here qualified to serve as a shepherd of the congregation? It may be that we get some names of men who are qualified. It may be that there are not any. But we want to do that. And they felt that there were a couple, and so that was the reason the elders themselves had initiated that. And in that situation, all that went well, and I think they ended up installing maybe a couple of guys. But I've not been at a congregation, thankfully, but I've talked to those who have, where something similar happened, and all of a sudden, it was like election season. I mean, there's like a campaign going on. And you got guys that they want to be in the eldership, they want to be that top dog, so I mean, it's almost like a politician kissing babies, and I mean, I'm talking people that would never hardly speak to anybody, and all of a sudden after that announcement, you can watch any given service of the church. They're making their way around the building, they're talking, they're laughing, and I mean, it's just over the top friendliness, and what was it? It was campaigning. And that's how sometimes people look at it, like, oh, I got a chance to advance. And if that's my mentality, I'm already disqualified from any type of leadership among the Lord's people. God is looking for servants. And how ironic is it that sometimes, I don't know, dare I say, every time, the greatest servants, the greatest characters in Scripture are those who someone comes to them, often God comes to them and says, I have a work for you. And they're not like, took you long enough, thank you for finally recognizing my abilities, my qualifications. Yes, I will take this on, and I will show you my skills. It's actually quite the opposite, right? I read about a man named Moses, and he's just a shepherd. He's just out in the wilderness keeping sheep. And God comes to him and says, Moses, you're going to lead my people out of Israel. And Moses is like, hold on, I'm nobody. You want me to go stand before Pharaoh, the most powerful leader in the known world right now? I'm not even a good speaker. You don't want me for this. In fact, he finally gets to the point, he says, just choose somebody else. God says, no, you're the man for the job, Moses. Now, about 40 years previous, Moses really thought he was the man for the job. We don't learn that until Acts 7, Stephen's sermon. But he thought he was the man for the job. And it would seem, at least, it never comes out and tells us in Scripture, but it would seem that in itself is what disqualified him for some time. He went off to the wilderness, he got married, he had some children, he matured, and he learned some humility. Then God comes to him and says, I want you to lead my people, Moses. Read about Gideon. Gideon is hiding. He's at a wine press threshing wheat. You don't thresh wheat at a wine press. Well, you do if you're worried about Midianites coming and stealing it all the time. So you try to do it in such a way as to get away with it. Nobody will think to look for you threshing wheat at a wine press. And he says, you're going to deliver my people from the Midianites. And again, Gideon's like, hold the phone. I'm not your guy. I'm nobody. My tribe is small. I'm one of the least. No. God says, yeah, you're the man for the job. And on we could go. King Saul, same thing. He's like, I'm not the guy. David was not, looking to, when God selected him to be the next king, David's not, well, I'm going to make this happen. In fact, he has 2 chances to kill King Saul, and he says, I won't raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. God will make me king when he's ready. But over and over again, you see the people that God wants to lead, they're not, with their hand in the air going, pick me, pick me, pick me. They're just humbly going about their business. And many times, even when God says, hey, it's time, I want you to step up and serve in this leadership role, they're like, I don't know. So Jesus says, you want to be great? Be a servant. He's looking for humble servants, not bosses, not people that are competing for top position, top rank, and so on. Now let's go into chapter 10. Chapter 10 of Mark. There are a few questions in between that we covered in the book of Matthew, particularly Matthew 17, Matthew 20, even Matthew 19. But drop down to the toward the end of the chapter, and we'll pick up at verse 6. They came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the highway side begging. Now, I won't get into it here because it really gets us into apologetics and that kind of thing. And but I will tell you there's a really good article on apologeticspress.org if you want to check it out, because sometimes people will criticize the Bible because some accounts, I believe it's Matthew's account, has Jesus in Jericho. And then here you have Jesus, he came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with the disciples. I think maybe Matthew's account has him coming into Jericho, and so people cry out contradiction. Sometimes you have skeptics, and but they'll say that's a contradiction. He was either coming in or he was going out. It can't be both. But the long and short of it is there are at least a couple of different possible solutions. Let me get to it's driving me crazy to remember in Matthew's account whether he says coming into or he just says in Jericho. Anybody got a cross-reference there? I'm trying to, is it Matthew 17? I think it's after 17. Or it may not be in Matthew's account. I may be thinking of Luke's. 20? There it is. Okay, I was looking too far ahead. As they departed from Jericho. And then you've got coming to Jericho in Mark. And then as he went out of Jericho. Anyway, there were actually 2 Jerichos. There was old Jericho, and then it was a city that got rebuilt in a slightly different location, very nearby, and so it may be that in one account it's talking about him coming out of the older part, and he's coming into that newer, or it might have been vice versa, but going out of one, coming into the other. That seems to me to be the most plausible, likely explanation. But all that just to say, if there's any possible explanation that works, even if there are multiple ones, and we don't know exactly which one, but if there is a possible solution that is viable, you don't have a contradiction, you don't have a discrepancy, and that's the case here. But so you have blind Bartimaeus, and when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, picking up here in Mark 10:47, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me." And many charged him that he should hold his peace, but he cried the more a great deal, "Thou son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. And they called the blind man, saying unto him, "Be of good comfort, rise, he calleth thee." And he, casting away his garment, rose and came to Jesus. And Jesus answered and said unto him, What wilt thou that I should do unto thee? The blind man said unto him, Lord, that I might receive my sight. And Jesus said unto him, Go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole. And immediately he received his sight. It's one of Mark's favorite words there, euthus in the Greek. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus in the way. So Jesus asks a strange question, what do you want me to do for you? Reminds us of John 5 where he says to the lame man there, do you want to be healed? And, maybe you've read that one before and maybe this one as well, and you're kind of like, not trying to be disrespectful, but that seems an odd question. It kind of seems like you're asking the obvious. But deity never asks a question for information. So why does Jesus ask this question? Well, I think it's, again, for the crowd's sake, and even for our sakes today, reading this years later, centuries later. He's focusing attention on the miracle. Number one is going to be an immediate healing. We already saw that there in verse, 52? It's going to point out Jesus' mercy, which he had cried out for over and over in this context. It's going to show Jesus' power because Jesus says, and in fact, this is a slightly different question from what he asked in John 5. In John 5, he says, do you want to be healed? Here he says, what do you want? What's that next word? Me to do for you. That puts the emphasis, the focus on Jesus. Who's going to heal him? Who's capable of healing him? God, Jesus. And so seems to be pointing that attention to Jesus and his power. And then, of course, the man's faith here. We pointed out last week or maybe a couple weeks ago, sometimes miracles were done because of somebody else's faith. Sometimes they're not based on anybody's faith at all. But sometimes Jesus will say specifically to someone, your faith has made you whole. And that's what he says to this man. And so Jesus heals him and he receives his sight. And so a great question there. What do you want me to do for you? Pointing out to that man, to the crowd, Jesus' power, Jesus' mercy, and they're going to see. Here's a man who can't see, and just like that, he's going to receive his sight. And so a great, great miracle that Jesus did there for Bartimaeus. We'll pick up, Lord willing, with Mark chapter 12, our next question next week. I did want to point out something I'm going to try to get to it before the second bell. But you'll see something, it's sometimes used other places in the New Testament, and I haven't even done enough study to say this with great authority, but it seems to me I see it a decent amount in Mark. I'm not enough of a Greek expert to say that with the utmost confidence, but you see this in verse 49. It says, Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called, and they call the blind man. You see a present tense there, and I was looking to see if it's, I can't remember what version. I was looking at the versions compared and trying to remember which one it is. There's a version that has usually there's like an asterisk or something like that. Yeah. And it is what I was thinking, right? They call the blind man. It's present tense in the King James. But there's no New American Standard Bible, 1995. There's this note several times whenever this is used. They'll put a little star or asterisk. It says, a star is used to mark verbs that are historical presents in the Greek, which have been translated with an English past tense in order to conform to modern usage. In other words, they called the man, was how we would say it. But in the Greek, literally, it says they call the man, present tense. The translators recognize that in some contexts, the present tense seems more unexpected and unjustified to the English reader than a past tense would have been. But Greek authors frequently use the present tense for sake of heightened vividness, thereby transporting their readers in imagination to the actual scene at the time of occurrence. However, the translators felt that it would be wise to change these historical presents to English past tenses. In other words, and I say this because if you remember from, we've talked about Mark before, especially the book of the month, Mark is like a child sometimes breathlessly telling this story this account of the life of a man who was more than a man. And so sometimes, a child will come home from school and they're telling you about something that happened, and they won't say, these people, they were getting into an argument, and he said to her such and such, and then she said, a child a lot of times will get excited, and they'll describe it as if it's happening right now, right? And I'll say, so he says to her, blah, 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 and then she turns around and she says to him, and they're using all these present tense verbs. And a lot of times it's that excitement, that enthusiasm in telling you about what happened. You see this a lot in the book of Mark, because he is just breathlessly telling you about this man who was not just a man, and he's just overflowing with enthusiasm. It's not just Mark, but you do see it a lot in the book of Mark. So if you see in your King James Version a present tense verb that sounds kind of out of place, it's likely this historical present, as the scholars call it. All right, that's a good stopping point. Lord willing, we'll pick up Mark 12. Our next question will be in 12:24, and we'll pick up there, God willing, next week. Thank y'all so much. We'll have a short break before our worship period.